sir.
So, I found it kind of curious, sort of in Western music, everybody has a 12-tone scale, right?
No. Oh, in Western music? Well, for the past 300 years.
Right, right. But you go to some different cultures, you might have a 5-note scale,
or a 26-note Slendra.
Haven't heard of one.
Or a 19-note raga. Yeah.
Is there any reason other than just pure historical chance that we seem to
I'm not an ethnomusicologist, but I'm interested in things, so I did take courses and work with an ethnomusicologists and so on. We recognize the octave, and most cultures also recognize the fifth, and that's because, as you're probably aware, when there's a regularly I was going to use music notation. Never mind. Well, we can do it with fractions, though. You know, the natural overtone series. You know, if there's a regularly repeating vibration, then you're going to get the fundamental, and then there will be an octave, and then basically 2-1, 3-2, 4-3, and so on. So there's a fifth, and then another octave, and a third, and a fifth, and a flat seventh, and so on. And as you go up in any natural harmonic series, which is most plucked strings, most conical or cylindrically shaped air columns excite these kind of series. The higher up the overtones are, the harder they are to hear, although they're the collection and the relative intensities of the various components determine the timbre. We say timbre in music. Do you guys say timbre? The engineers say timbre. It drives me nuts. At any rate, that's what determines the timbre or the specific sound of an instrument. But we can easily hear a fifth, and then the next one's an octave. The third's a little harder to hear. In Western music, there's a lot of theorists that think that since our music is so based on triadic sonorities, it is octaves, fifths, and thirds, that it came about through a perception of the overtone series. I don't know how true that is, but it would also lead to scales of a pentatonic nature, which many cultures and most primitive tribes have. So that's the only thing I can think is that perception of the overtone series, especially if you have a really long string. You know, I can see a bunch of guys out in the jungle with nothing to do, you know, getting a long vine, stretching it really tight at one end and giving it a pull, maybe because they're trying to make a giant bow and arrow. And wow, you would hear easily some of those overtones because they're not so stratospherically high. Just a guess. Yes, sir?
I have a question about making the construction of particularly string instruments, but I guess it also applies to woodwinds and brass. But in terms of, I don't know much about the subject, but I've heard, obviously there are more desirable instruments than you could buy, at the local store. What makes a good, say a good violin? What's the difference, and why is it so hard to reproduce that or recreate that?
Well, there's two things, I think, and it's a fair question because, my God, my street playing colleagues invest upwards of millions of dollars in their instruments. The first thing I would have to say on that is, these are not rich people. And if they're willing to spend that kind of money on instruments because it will improve what they do, then there's a reason. I remember when I first came here, Norman Hackerman was the president of the university. He's a terrific chemist. But the first lecture he gave to the music faculty is, I've done studies on polymers, and I don't understand why you don't use a good plastic bow. It cost you $35. Why do you have to spend $80,000 on a wooden bow? And I was only 26, and I said, Dr. Hackerman, don't you think that if these guys could get a bow for $85 that sounded as good as an $80,000 bow, they would do that? Which then I've learned was a bad thing to do. We ended up becoming friends later in life, though. My father-in-law sits on he died when he was the chairman of the Welch Foundation. Norman Hackerman is always one of the scientific advisors to that. But the two parts of that response are, one, a desirable instrument is constructed in such a way that it provides the fewest amount of impediments to its performance. You know, which doesn't mean to say just because it's easy to play, it's automatically a better instrument, but certainly we don't need extra impediments. So student instruments oftentimes are cheap and students can afford them, but they're so hard to play that they can prevent people from developing. And then the other thing, of course, is that overtone series we're talking about, and that's purely subjective. A societally agreed upon agenda of what makes a good sound, and what's desirable and what's pleasing, and it's different from different cultures, but it's pretty well established that the Guarneri and the Stradivari and the Cremona violins sound that way, and that the modern instruments just don't. Yes?
Since you were a composer, I have kind of a question about compositions. So people think about like great pieces, and I'm only talking about classical music, like something like a 7-part fugue in opera or something. How important, or do people even look at all, like something like the mathematical complexity of the piece? Or is it simply, you know, this is great because of subjective things and we don't really hear these?
Great art exists on many levels, and repeated listenings of great art will give you continual rewards. And so you can listen to Bach at that level, or you can listen to him purely at the surface level and find enjoyment. Mies van der Rohe, the architect, said God lives in the details, and those are the details that are of concern mostly to theorists and composers. They can be of concern to the average listener, they usually aren't, but if that music did not also appeal on the surface level, who cares about the rest of it, you know? It's just great. There's always some kind of profound depth to great art, and the deeper you look, the more you see. And that's, of course, in stark contrast to most of the other types of things that we enjoy.
Cool. Well, I think there's a class that's going to get started, so we're out of time, but let's thank our speaker one more time. Thanks for coming.
I encourage you to come by the Shepherd School. It's considered the finest student orchestra in North America, and there's a reason for that. There's a concert tonight, tomorrow night also, and it's free. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.